It is late on the night of the 23rd of July, 1895, in Vienna. In a house in the 9th district of the city, a middle-aged, pioneering doctor sleeps and dreams. It is an unusual dream. He is in a banqueting hall, and there are many people there, including a former patient of his named Irma. He sees that she is ill, and that the source of her illness is a botched injection. When he arises, the man writes down the contents of the dream about Irma's injection before he forgets it. In the weeks that follow, he analyzes it repeatedly and becomes convinced that the dream is a manifestation of his hidden desires and his anxiety about his inability to cure Irma when she was his patient. Irma's injection is the first dream he studies in detail as he develops his groundbreaking interpretation of dreams. The man's name? Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis. The man known to history as Sigmund Freud was born at 6:30 p.m. on the 6th of May 1856 in Freiberg in Moravia, now the Czech Republic, and was given the name Sigmund Shlomo Freud. Family legend records that an old peasant woman declared at his birth that the world had been given, quote, a great man. His father, Jakob Freud, a wool merchant, was born on the 18th of December 1815 in Galicia, now part of Ukraine. The son of Shlomo Freud, his ancestors had fled persecution and, in the 19th century, had moved from Lithuania through Galicia and into German Austria. Jakob grew up speaking Yiddish and married twice or possibly 3 times, with his first marriage at the age of 17 to Sally Canner, producing 2 sons, Emmanuel and Philip, and a possible second to a woman named Rebecca. At age 40, on the 29th of July 1855, he married Amalia Nathanson in Vienna, after which they moved to Freiberg. A gentle, kind, optimistic man with a sense of humour, he was already a grandfather when Sigmund Freud was born. Freud later said he was similar physically to his father, although Jakob was slightly taller. Freud and his father were close, and they walked together when Sigmund was a child, but a story Freud later told is revealing. Jakob had related one day how a Christian had abused him in the street, knocked his cap off, and Jakob had meekly picked up his cap and left, displaying, in young Freud's view, an unheroic temperament. Young Freud was dismayed by this idea of his father as weak, and to compensate for the consequent ambivalence he felt towards Jakob, he idolized the heroic avenger Hannibal, a brilliant general who fought against the Roman Empire. Little is known about Freud's mother, Amalia, who was born on the 18th of August 1835 in Brody, northeast Galicia. As a child, she lived with her Orthodox Jewish family in Odessa and then Vienna. Sigmund Freud was her first child, born when she was 21. A second son, Julius, died at just 8 months. A daughter, Anna, was born on the 31st of December 1858, followed by Rosa, Marie, Adolphine, Paula, and finally Alexander, who was 10 years younger than Sigmund. Amalia was a vivacious, sharp, intelligent woman who could be passionate, but she suffered from ill health, and her frequent pregnancies often rendered her absent from her family. Freud later said he inherited her sentimentality, as in her passionate temperament. Sigmund Freud's first years were spent in a single room above a blacksmith shop and, according to Freud, were, quote, hard times and not worth remembering. The premature death of his sibling Julius and the death of his mother's brother during her second pregnancy deepened the bond between Amalia and Sigmund, although Julius's death prompted feelings of guilt in Freud, who had resented his arrival. Freud was cared for by a Catholic Czech nursemaid who took him to church. While Amalia was giving birth, Philip, Freud's stepbrother, fired the nanny for stealing, and this event triggered a severe bout of anxiety in Freud, who feared his mother would suffer the same fate. Advances in technology were changing the economic landscape, causing hardship for traditional trades, with Jewish businesses concomitantly subject to scapegoating. In 1859, the family business, run by Jacob, collapsed. The Freud family moved from Freiberg to Leipzig for a year, then Vienna, while the stepbrothers emigrated to England. Vienna in the mid-19th century was a product of the failed revolutions that swept Europe in 1848 and would remain in turmoil when, in 1866, the Austro-Prussian War saw Austria lose influence amid rising nationalism. Jewish communities in Europe had, at that point, tended to be small communities living as minority groups. Jewish families often moved around while relying on strong religious and family traditions to sustain their identity. Families like the Freuds learnt to live with suspicion and prejudice, with the notion of success being inextricably bound up with the prospect of survival. In Freiberg, 130 Jews were living in a community of approximately 5,000 Christians. Between 1840 and 1880, over 200,000 migrated within Europe as they sought work in Western Europe. With the Austrian Empire disintegrating, in 1849, Emperor Franz Joseph granted Jews full civic rights in Austria. In post-industrial revolution Europe, modernization presented a challenge to Orthodox Judaism. The Jewish Enlightenment, or Haskalah, was moving in the direction of a more rational, skeptical humanist faith, with Jewish communities finding their place in a changed Europe, although with an enduring sense of the otherness of eternal migrants always fearing displacement, a feeling which lay at the heart of Freud's work. Freud was to embrace the modern liberal politics of the age as a foundational principle of his theory of psychoanalysis, and, as the first member of his family to enjoy the freedoms of the Enlightenment, Freud, along with his generation of Jews, felt they had finally found a secure place in Vienna and a cultural home. The horrors that were to come in the late 1930s and 1940s were unimaginable at the time. On the journey to Vienna, Freud developed a fear of rail travel that would plague him all his life, as an adult insisting on traveling separately from his family. But he later revealed that he saw his pregnant mother naked on the train, and that it may have precipitated the anxiety. The Freud family settled in Vienna and lived in the Jewish quarter of Leopoldstadt. During Freud's early years, Amalia developed a lung disease, possibly tuberculosis, which meant she was frequently away taking rest cures when she wasn't giving birth to Freud's siblings, so Freud's bond with his mother was constantly interrupted. Freud was plagued with anxious dreams during his childhood, which he later identified as being associated with the fear of his mother dying. In a complicated, mixed family environment, a favourite playmate was his stepbrother Emmanuel's son, John, but it was an intense relationship veering between affection and hostility. Freud later wrote, quote, "An intimate friend and hated enemy have always been indispensable to my emotional life, and, not infrequently, my childish ideal has been so closely approached that friend and enemy have coincided in the same person." While Freud later described his family as poor, their Vienna apartment was larger than the Freiberg home, although it had no bathroom, and they had servants, visited the theatre, and took summer vacations. The Freuds were a close family who, uncharacteristically for the period, had regular family council meetings. By the age of 7, Sigmund was a brilliant student taught by his mother, then his father, before entering the Sperl Gymnasium public school at just 9, where, as he later recalled, he was top of my class for 7 years. Young Freud learned Greek, Latin, French and English, and received Hebrew instruction. Amalia called Freud her golden Siggy, and family life centered around his needs, with a private room in the small apartment reserved for his studies. When Sister Anna started piano lessons, Freud's peace was disturbed, and they were brought to an untimely end. Sigmund loved reading books, a favorite being Cervantes' Don Quixote, and he had a particular affection for Shakespeare's plays. Amalia spoke of strangers who recognized a golden future for her son, but whether this praise inculcated confidence or stress in Freud is impossible to know. Freud grew up to be phobic, subject to depression, obsessive even, but, as he admitted, with, quote, "a thirst for grandeur." Freud's sister, Anna, later suggested he was a pedantic, somewhat pompous child who lectured his siblings on their academic studies. He had few friends, only study companions, including one, Eduard Silberstein, whom he remained in contact with for many years, and Freud recognized that he lacked the, quote, "indefinite something that attracts other people." However, a brief infatuation with a girl, Gisela, in Freiberg when he was 16, occasioned a flow of romantic correspondence, although little came of the youthful passion. As he approached the end of his school days, as the oldest son of the second marriage, the family's expectations and future rested on his shoulders, although Jakob gave him free rein in his choice of profession. In his last year of school, Freud had become fascinated by Darwin's evolutionary theories, so he decided to eschew the expected professions of medicine, law or politics, and chose biological sciences instead. In 1880s Vienna, over half the physicians were Jewish, but Freud felt anti-Semitism would hamper his progress at a time when the fallout from the 1873 Black Friday stock market crash had ignited further anti-Semitic prejudice. At 17, he enrolled in the University of Vienna Medical School, where, inspired by Professor Franz Brentano, who combined theology, phenomenology, psychology, and Darwinism, Freud anticipated a career that would combine philosophy and zoology. In 1875, Freud moved on to Karl Klaus's laboratory and found himself in Trieste, researching the question of whether eels were hermaphroditic. His conscientiousness and diligence caught the attention of famed physiologist Ernst Breuer, who, like Freud, favoured reason over superstition and biology over faith, and was a leading figure in the renowned Helmholtz School of Medicine. In 1876, Freud was accepted into the Institute of Physiology as a research student in Breuer's laboratory with colleagues Ernst von Fleischl-Marxau and Sigmund Exner. Under Breuer, Freud studied the nervous system, clarifying each stage of evolutionary development and making impressive findings about the continuity between the nervous systems of lower and higher animals. Freud just lost out to rival researchers in the race to formulate the theory of neurons and neural communication. While working with Breuer, Freud met Josef Breuer, who was to be a major force in his life. Breuer, who was 15 years older than Freud, became a father figure and mentor who offered both emotional and financial support. Freud completed a year of military service in 1879, which he found boring, so he was relieved when invited to translate the work of John Stuart Mill into German before returning to medical school and graduating in 1881 with distinction. He chose to stay on with Breuer. In 1882, Freud met Martha Bernays when she was visiting one of his sisters, fell in love, and within 2 months proposed marriage, although the wedding took place 4 years later. Martha, born on the 26th of July 1861 and 5 years his junior, was slim, petite, well-educated and intelligent with many admirers. There were familial connections with Martha's sister, Minna, engaged to a friend of Freud's, and Martha's brother, Eli, married to Freud's sister, Anna. Freud, who had a meagre income as a junior researcher and still relied on subsidies from his father, was forced to delay his nuptials. Martha's mother, who was not impressed with Freud, moved Martha home to her Jewish family in Wandsbek in Hamburg. Although Freud identified culturally as a Jew, he was an atheist, but this did not preclude his courtship of Martha, who was brought up in an Orthodox Jewish family and whose grandfather had been the chief rabbi of Hamburg, and they exchanged daily substantive correspondence. They discussed politics, philosophy, and Darwinism, among other subjects, with Freud sometimes showing moments of either social ineptitude or searing truthfulness, such as, quote, "I know you are not beautiful in a painter's sense. What I meant to convey was how much the magic of your being expresses itself in your countenance and your body." Freud was passionately in love and sometimes experienced fits of jealousy about Martha's other admirers. To be in a financial position to marry Martha, Freud needed a well-paying job, so he became an apprentice in Vienna's General Hospital, moving from surgery to internal medicine and, in May 1883, on to the psychiatry clinic run by Theodor Meinert. At this point, he was able to leave home and live in the hospital's interns' accommodation. During the engagement, Freud argued with Martha's brother Eli over a loan requested by Martha. Freud's fury at this perceived slight and his antipathy towards Martha's family strained their relationship, but Martha navigated her way through the ensuing tensions, although Freud didn't speak to Eli for years. The engagement was protracted and intense, with both of them somewhat exhausted at the end of it, but still in love and longing for the day they could marry. Freud was a highly regarded neuropathologist known for locating obscure brain lesions in post-mortem dissections, but he wanted to specialize in nervous diseases. The nervous diseases department was badly run, and tensions between Freud and its superintendent, Franz Schultz, saw Freud transferred to ophthalmology in February 1885 and then to dermatology. Freud had the right connections, and with several papers published, in 1885 he became a university lecturer and Privatdozent, a low-level, unpaid but highly prized position that paved the way for private medical practice, essential to his wedding plans. Cases of mental illness were on the rise in the 18th and 19th centuries, and asylums proliferated in Vienna, which was considered a centre of pioneering treatments for medical and psychiatric disorders. Between 1884 and 1887, Freud gained notoriety by publishing 6 papers on a narcotic. He told Martha in a letter that he had taken a drug for depression, although he had not become addicted, and that, quote, "this magical substance lifted me to the heights." In the papers, Freud claimed that a specific narcotic could treat neurasthenia and morphine withdrawal, assertions which were disputed by colleagues. Freud's drive for success had seemingly led him to make rash claims, although he had always rather disdained scientific exactitude. Freud correctly identified that the narcotic might be used as an anesthetic in other medical procedures, but while he was visiting Martha, another doctor, Carl Jung, presented a paper on its use during ophthalmological surgery. Years later, he wrote that he bore his then-fiancée, quote, "no grudge for her interruption of my work." So committed was Freud to the beneficial use of the narcotic that he provided it to his colleague and friend Ernst von Fleischl-Marxau, a wealthy, handsome young man, to treat morphine withdrawal. Fleischl-Marxau used it in injections and became addicted, dying 5 years later. Freud had extrapolated from his own responses to the drug to apply them to everyone, despite the available evidence. Nevertheless, the essays he wrote on the use of drugs were visionary in terms of his innovative understanding of mood disorders, and he has subsequently been credited as one of the founders of modern psychopharmacology. Freud was increasingly fascinated with neuroanatomy, and in 1885, having been offered a position at the first public institute for children's diseases in Vienna, he won a fellowship to pursue brain studies at the clinic of the world-famous Jean-Martin Charcot in Salpêtrière, Paris, who was an expert on hysteria and considered the founder of modern neurology. At that time, hysteria was a broad category applied to various symptoms such as neurological symptoms without apparent nerve damage, or mood disorders such as depression, anxiety, and hallucinations. Charcot's work pioneered the use of hypnosis to reproduce symptoms and, questionably, to remove them, and Charcot's well-attended talks and lectures often centered around women who were dramatically exposed as being liable to hysteria using hypnosis. The clinic proved unsuitable for Freud's research, but he became fascinated by Charcot's study of hysteria. Like Breuer and Breuer before, Charcot became a mentor and father figure for Freud. Freud offered to translate Charcot's lectures into German and attended parties at Charcot's house. Freud was so taken by Charcot's methods that he wrote to Martha saying, quote, "After some lectures, I walk away as from Notre Dame, with a new perception of perfection. Freud spent several weeks in Berlin at Adolf Baginski's Clinic for Children's Diseases and then returned to Vienna, where he opened a private practice. In October 1886, he gave a lecture on male hysteria to the Viennese Society of Physicians, but the chair of the meeting and other doctors, including Meinert, dismissed Freud's findings as unoriginal. Freud later gave a somewhat distorted account of events, suggesting that their skepticism was a reaction to his novel approach. Freud was excluded from the laboratory of brain anatomy and resolved to retire from academia. Freud's private practice opened in 1886, with initial patients referred by Breuer, and with that source of income in place, he married Martha in September of that year. They had a civil ceremony on the 13th of September in Wandsbek Town Hall, followed by a religious ceremony the following day. 13 months later, their first child, Mathilde, was born, followed by 5 others: Jean-Martin, Oliver, Ernst, Sophie, and lastly Anna, who was to gain fame in her own right as a psychotherapist. The Freuds lived on a tight budget, with money a concern for many years. Freud continued work in neurology, publishing a well-received book on the aphasias in 1891, which included a new functional explanation of aphasia, a category of language disorder. He treated patients initially with electrotherapy, which he found to be ineffective, so he turned to exercise, hydrotherapy, and, following Charcot's example, hypnosis. He began a partnership with Breuer, and the two developed a theory of curing hysteria, which they characterized as a form of storytelling, coming to the famous conclusion that, quote, hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences. In 1895, they published Studies on Hysteria, outlining these theories, which were based on findings from case histories. According to Freud, confronting patients with the truth of their histories liberated them from the symptoms of hysteria. Like others before them, such as Arthur Schopenhauer and psychiatrists working in the 1850s, Freud and Breuer were seeking to elucidate the workings of the unconscious, a well-established element of the mental processes. Freud and Breuer developed a theory claiming that the complex thoughts of the unconscious could remain inaccessible to conscious thought, and that deviant notions could produce specific effects. Unlike the more cautious Breuer, Freud aimed to show that symptoms symbolized unpalatable ideas that remained split off from awareness. Freud drew on his work with a female patient, quote, Frau Cecilie M., who was the Baroness Anna von Lieben, a wealthy noblewoman married to a Jewish banker and a patient of Breuer, who suffered from feelings of worthlessness, pain, and memory loss. Freud had twice daily sessions with von Lieben for 3 years, using initially hypnosis and moving on to a listening cure with a form of, quote, free association, which involved allowing the patient to talk in a stream of consciousness of memories, dreams, and thoughts, without pause or interruption, a practice believed to uncover the contents of the unconscious mind. Freud would sit by the couch she chose to lie on and, aided by input from von Lieben, symptoms were allocated meaning and were resolved, only to be replaced by other symptoms. Von Lieben had an addiction to narcotics, which complicated her illness, and when treatment came to an end, little had been accomplished. despite a contemporary psychotherapeutic stance that would negate Freud's theory and criticize his method of leading the patient, Freud's Studies was a seminal text of literary merit that championed the, quote, talking cure and collaborative inquiry, which were to become the basis of the practice of psychotherapy. By the time Studies was published, the relationship between Freud and Breuer had disintegrated. Freud used the term psychoanalysis for the first time in a paper published in French on the 30th of March 1896. Freud became committed to the theory of sexual disruptions being at the heart of all hysteria cases, whereas Breuer was more circumspect, suggesting later that Freud's, quote, absolute and excessive formulations gave rise to generalizations. Freud felt isolated professionally at this point and turned to a new partner, Wilhelm Fliess. Fliess, 2 years younger than Freud, self-confident and a brilliant talker, was an ear, nose and throat specialist who had attended Freud's lectures on the recommendation of Breuer. The two developed an intense rapport and wrote to each other many times a week, enthusiastically sharing ideas. Fliess proffered unconventional theories centered around the idea that the nose was a sexual organ governing cycles in human affairs and that nose surgery could cure psychological symptoms caused by sexual repression. He also believed that bisexuality was a universal state experienced in cycles. Fliess's theories resonated with Freud, who worked to distinguish between, quote, actual neuroses with a neurological basis and mind-based mental illnesses. Freud believed himself to suffer from the former, having symptoms of exhaustion, depression, phobias, and heart palpitations. Freud concluded that, quote, neurasthenia is always only a sexual neurosis. If this were the case, Freud controversially argued, then better contraception and free love would encourage, quote, sexual relations with full potency as a matter of public health. In April 1896, Freud delivered a speech entitled The Etiology or Causes of Hysteria, based on a study of 18 patients stating that whatever symptoms initiated the analysis, quote, we infallibly come to the field of sexual experience. In a stunning addition, Freud argued that, quote, premature sexual experience was the sole precondition for the development of hysteria. Freud elaborated on this theory to include other disorders, such as obsessive disorder and paranoia, as having the same cause and offered a new category named neuroses of defense. Freud's theory was met with skepticism and criticism, dismissed by some as, quote, a scientific fairy tale. It emerged that the 18 patients he based his theory on had not reported sexual abuse initially, and that Freud had published his earlier book recounting those cases without mention of it. Freud later distanced himself from the speech and adopted the term seduction theory, which perhaps conjures up unfortunate notions of victim complicity. Freud was sympathetic to victims of childhood abuse and identified the abuse as causing, quote, grotesque and tragic consequences. But Freud's resolve to determine a singular cause precluded a more complex approach as he worked to discover fundamental laws. Freud delved further into this research, sending copious notes to Fliess under the banner Project for a Scientific Psychology, which were published after Freud's death by Fliess's widow, but as he turned 40, he decided to abandon the project. During the remaining years of the 1890s, he worked feverishly on other avenues, alternating between periods of depression and elation, but failed to establish his reputation. When his father died in October 1896 at the age of 81, Freud expressed grief and wrote to Fliess of his admiration for Jacob, who had, quote, a mixture of deep wisdom and fantastic light-heartedness. As the decade came to an end, the loss of his father, which left Freud, quote, quite uprooted, provoked Freud into analyzing his own mental health as he noted down his dreams, memory lapses, and slips of the tongue. The Freud family moved to more spacious accommodation at Bergasse 19 in 1891, where they lived for 47 years. Freud was a man of contradictions, loving yet remote, easygoing yet anxious. He was a devoted family man, regaling Fliess with the exploits of his children, but he didn't spend much time with them. Described by his daughter Anna as a, quote, simple man, he eschewed complications, resisted formality and restriction, and embraced imaginative inquiry, considering himself a, quote, adventurer. While devoted to his wife, Martha, his closest confidant was Martha's more intellectual sister, Minna, who had moved in with them in 1896, some years after the death of her erstwhile fiancé, Ignaz Schönberg. Freud was an avid traveller, but often racked with anxiety about losing luggage or being late for a train's departure. He only took his family on trips to the mountains, where he indulged his love of walking and foraging for mushrooms, preferring the company of Minna or his brother Alexander on trips to the Mediterranean. His days were regimented and long, with his patient sessions starting at 8 a.m., each lasting 55 minutes, followed by 5 minutes for tea. The morning session stopped at 1, and lunch was at 5 past, when he joined his already seated family. After lunch, he strolled through the city with stops at a cigar shop and a barber shop for a beard trim. Freud loved antiquities, and a dealer showed him items once a fortnight. At 3 p.m., Freud gave consultations for patients without appointments, and at 4 p.m., he resumed psychoanalysis sessions. He had dinner with his family at 7, and then enjoyed a second walk, perhaps accompanied by Martha or a child. Freud would then deal with correspondence in his office, and after that, work on his books and articles between 11 and 2 a.m. On Saturdays, Freud delivered an unscripted lecture at the university, having made mental notes on his walk there, and played tarot, a card game with friends in the evening, while Sundays were devoted to his 6 children, who later spoke of him as a loving father. His only other pleasure was Tuesday meetings of the B'nai B'rith, an international Jewish organization where the company of men of, quote, high character could be enjoyed. Freud's health was always compromised as he suffered from migraines and sinus issues, and later arrhythmia, while constantly struggling with depression, although he was undoubtedly an optimist, writing, quote, I need not be anxious about the final success of my efforts. It is purely a matter of how long it will take. While Freud pursued his self-analysis, dreams in particular captured his attention, and he increasingly came to believe they resembled symptoms in terms of their symbolism of inner turmoil. The next book Freud published in 1899, The Interpretation of Dreams, encompassing memoir, sociological comment, folk tales and classical text, was a turning point for Freud's work and became one of the most influential books of the 20th century. For Freud, dreams were symptoms of repressed, unpalatable thoughts, but now it was the child's repressed, incestuous desires that were the cause, with dreams acting as the, quote, fulfillments of wishes. Freud postulated that their symbolism was the key to understanding, quote, a knowledge of the unconscious activity of the mind. A breakthrough in Freud's self-analysis had recently occurred. He had been dreaming about his nanny and asked his mother, Amalia, to clarify the events surrounding her dismissal. He realized fear of his mother's dismissal, death, had triggered his anxiety because he was, quote, in love with my mother and jealous of my father. He wrote to Fliess that this proved the, quote, gripping power of Oedipus Rex. In Freud's view, the Oedipal experience was a universal one. A contemporary, Carl Jung, praised Freud for explaining the conflicting nature of family life, of highlighting the child's dilemma in balancing love and resentment, but disagreed with Freud's conclusion that the challenges of childhood had a sexual nature. Freud's thesis, inspired by his own experience, gave a dramatic twist to family drama with love, incest, and murderous thoughts now integral to it. Freud referred to a dream he called Irma's injection, where he identified extreme anxiety regarding a patient he was treating, a family friend. His analysis of his dream, drawing on concerns about Irma's health, his eldest daughter's health, his conscientiousness and his reputation, investigates every detail as symbolic of deeper concerns, and Freud duly wrote to Fliess, stating that one day a plaque on his house would declare, quote, here, on July the 24th, 1895, the secret of the dream revealed itself to Dr. Sigmund Freud. At the moment, there seems little prospect of it. Irma was based on a patient called Emma Eckstein, who had presented with symptoms of pain and bleeding in the nose. Freud had referred her to Fliess, given his theory about the nose and sexuality. Fliess had operated on Eckstein's nose as if it were a diseased sexual organ, but her nose became infected post-operation, and it was discovered that Fliess had inadvertently left gauze packed in the wound. Eckstein was seriously ill, and her face left permanently disfigured. This horrifying incident haunted Freud, who was always defensive about it, claiming that Fliess had correctly identified her as suffering from hysteria with the bleeding occurring at the, quote, sexually relevant times, according to Fliess's numerology scheme. The realities of the case suggest that Freud's dream was well grounded in transparent anxiety over a botched operation by a friend on his patient. Freud later realized that many of the seductions his patients had revealed were not real, and he wrote to Fliess in 1897 stating that he no longer believed in his seduction theory, but in the idea that these dreams were fantasies that felt real to the patient and that could represent a thwarted libido. In a well-established pattern, Freud ultimately fell out with Fliess in 1904 over Fliess's claim to be the sole creator of a theory of universal bisexuality and Fliess's publication of a critical pamphlet. While the science of the interpretation of dreams is considered suspect, Freud undoubtedly paved the way for honest, frank examinations of difficult emotions in childhood and intense rivalries in family life. Freud also created terms that are still used today, such as displacement or transference of emotions, repression of unpalatable ideas, and the dynamism of certain mental phenomena. Freud also delivered an assault on Victorian prudery, with psychology leading the way in social criticism concordant with the avant-garde movement in the arts. Although the praise for Freud's book was less than fulsome, it certainly garnered attention. Freud now focused on his groundbreaking theory of transference by writing about his work with a patient he called Dora, who was based on Ida Bauer, the 17-year-old daughter of another of Freud's patients, referred to Freud by Hans Zelenka, a family friend, who was suffering from depression, a nervous cough, and occasional inability to speak. It emerged during sessions with Freud that Zelenka, whose wife was having an affair with Ida's father, had made sexual advances towards Ida when she was only 13, and then again when she was 15. Freud's monograph, or study, outlined his interpretation of her symptoms as an indication that she was attracted to Zelenka and had repressed her sexual responses to him, despite all of Ida's protestations to the contrary. Ida ended treatment after 6 months, which Freud interpreted as due to her frustration that he had not kissed her and a wish to punish him as a result. The idea of transference, where the clinician stands in for the other important people in the patient's life, allowing neurotic symptoms to be acted out and thereby observed in the consulting room, was an innovation. At this point, Freud was encouraging his patients to freeze self-inquiry in the room and to say whatever came into their minds. Freud's Dora monograph also explored other sexual issues with a new freedom, including homosexuality as inherent in adolescent sexual exploration. Freud moved to explore the unconscious in other ways, and in 1901 he published The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, which proved to be his most widely read work, followed by Jokes and Their Relation to the Subconscious in 1905. Freud argued that slips of the tongue, to become known as Freudian slips, like dreams, represent wishes. Freud had noted his own slips and extrapolated to suggest a greater understanding of how the mind works through the structure of language, revealing itself through puns. Thanks to the intervention of well-connected patients, in 1902, Freud was finally made a professor at the university, despite an anti-Semitic policy precluding the appointment of Jewish professors. The Wednesday Psychological Society was established by Freud, fulfilling his dream of psychoanalysis as a movement and drawing its audience from Freud's lecture circuit. The society initially consisted of 5 physicians, including the eminent Alfred Adler, a doctor, psychotherapist, and social activist with social issues, theories of the mind, and sex as frequent topics. It grew to 20 members and welcomed artists, musicians, publishers, and educators. One member, Max Graf, a musicologist, said later it seemed as if a new religion was being formed with Freud as, quote, its new prophet. In 1908, Freud disbanded it and reconstituted it as the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, with the understanding that it was to focus on propagating his theories. One member, Carl Jung, a handsome Swiss physician 20 years younger than Freud, caught his eye as a successor to Fliess. However, Jung's ideas differed from Freud's. and he rejected the theory of sexual repression as the sole source of hysteria, believing that neurological abnormalities led to serious mental illness, which then unmasked the unconscious. Freud overlooked these differences, becoming obsessed with Jung despite the knowledge that, in 1909, Jung had become involved romantically with a patient, Sabine Spielrein. Although Jung admitted that he had seduced her, Freud insisted that, quote, "it was her doing, not yours." In 1910, women, including Spielrein, were admitted to the society, and when Spielrein presented a talk valorizing Jung's biological theories, Freud was displeased. However, he organized the International Psychoanalytic Society with Jung as its leader, to the chagrin of various society members, including Adler, who resigned, taking fellow members with him to a new association. Freud's dedicated supporters helped confirm Freud as the leader of the ever-expanding, influential psychoanalysis movement. In April 1908, the first International Psychoanalytic Congress was held in Salzburg, and in 1910, the first International Psychoanalytical Association was founded. Freud prepared an essay on a patient, Ernst Lanze, whom he called the Rat Man, a young soldier suffering from obsessive thoughts exacerbated by his father's death. Lanze first consulted Freud in October 1907 after an incident with a sadistic officer triggered excessive compulsive symptoms. Freud learnt that Lanze's father had been violent towards his son, his mother domineering and obsessional, but he relied on speculative connections to further the idea that the Oedipus complex was at play. Lanze's story of a sadistic practice using a rat to torture a prisoner led Freud to connect the word rat to supposed relevant issues and proclaim that the rat torture story served to, quote, fan into a flame all his premature suppressed impulses of cruelty, egoistic and sexual alike. Freud's account met with great acclaim at the Congress, positioned Lanze as the aggressor, with Freud arguing that an analyst could see through a patient's devious unconscious. Freud usually destroyed case notes, but the Lanze notes survived, and they suggest that Freud often led the analysis rather than taking the patient's recollection as his cue. Nevertheless, Lanze benefited from the therapeutic alliance, which allowed him to discuss his symptoms in a safe setting that normalized his feelings, giving him a positive outlook for the future, although his problems continued. Freud's analysis certainly embraced the perverse, depraved and absurd aspects of the human mind, and perhaps laid the path to the creative efforts of future artists, such as Louis Buñuel and Salvador Dali. In September 1909, Freud travelled to America with Jung and another friend, Sandor Ferenczi, where interest in new psychoanalytic theories was expanding, to receive an honorary doctorate from Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. Freud presented 5 lectures in German, which were met with an enthusiastic response and cemented the American interest in psychoanalysis as a new treatment method. The lectures sold well in book form, and magazines eagerly disseminated the theories of sublimation, repression, transference, and memory retrieval. Dream interpretation was entering the cultural zeitgeist and found its way into popular fiction. Freud was touched by the international recognition of his work, having often faced prejudice and criticism at home. Despite his disdain for biographers, in 1910 Freud published a book on Leonardo da Vinci, which further influenced the direction of literature. In the book, which he later called, quote, "the only beautiful thing I have ever written," Freud used his theories like a detective finding clues to illuminate the personality and drives of da Vinci. The book, drawing on history, developmental psychology, archaeology, art criticism, and iconography, ignited a vigorous debate about art and neurosis. Freud extrapolated from da Vinci's memory of a bird flying into his cradle to an idea that the bird was a vulture representing repressed drives that accounted for his homosexuality and his creativity. Freud suggested that because da Vinci was illegitimate and raised by a single mother, his homosexuality was inevitable. In fact, the bird that appeared was a kite, and da Vinci's mother married soon after he was born, highlighting Freud's tendency to shape the facts to suit his theories. However, historical and biographical literature was transformed by it, and the ensuing interest in psychological studies of drives in childhood and the role of identification reinvigorated the study of psychology. Modernism in literature reflected these new theories, with work by James Joyce and T.S. Eliot resplendent with hidden details to be mined. Freud's writing about projection, identification, and narcissism provided a resonant understanding of human behavior and gave people the tools to address the challenge of modernity in a new century, still used in popular self-help treatments. Freud investigated further the psychology of love and the mother fixation, which he asserted rendered men impotent in a marriage where the wife is seen as a Madonna. Freud presented his findings in 1909, optimistically encouraging the idea that men could free themselves of a drive to pursue, rescue, then abandon a scarlet woman, and instead explore lascivious sexual drives by taking a wife off her pedestal. Despite the overgeneralizations, Freud's insightful observations about society and relationships endure. Freud's friendship with Jung was beginning to strain, with Jung often giving lectures that were critical of Freud and suggesting to colleagues that Freud's self-analysis had fallen short, leaving Freud unable to empathize with patients. In 1912, Freud, anticipating a break with Jung, formed a secret group of 5 followers consisting of Abraham, Ferenczi, Ernest Jones, and 2 Viennese colleagues, Otto Rank and Hans Sachs, who were to spread the gospel of Freud's theories. Freud gave each member a gold ring with an antique stone to symbolize brotherly loyalty. With World War I on the horizon, Freud was depressed but worked on a new book, Totem and Taboo, which received mixed responses. The book's theories rest on the theory of evolution proposed by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck about inherited traits. Freud added to his previous work on the Oedipus complex, positing that the mechanism for the complex was inherited from our tribal ancestors. The idea of an innate anxiety about man's propensity for violence resonated at a time of impending war. Further, Freud argued against the damaging role played by monotheistic religion. However, the most valuable contribution of this book is his use of the term ambivalence, signifying competing Oedipal emotions such as adoration and murderous jealousy. It also worked as an attack on the religious Jung, whom he now denounced along with Adler. Freud's support of Jung had been misplaced, and later Jung suffered a psychotic illness after starting another relationship with a patient, while also, at the same time, gaining fame with his focus on myth. Turning against friends and colleagues was a lifetime pattern that Freud was aware of. He sometimes displayed a lack of empathy, and a degree of solipsism seems to have plagued Freud's relationships. Further, a somewhat incestuous circle of friends, lovers, and patients, which would cross a line for contemporary psychotherapists, existed, with Freud even analysing his own daughter, Anna. Freud's changing loyalties had a somewhat corrosive effect on a group that competed for his praise. In 1913, when Jung's name came up for re-election at the Munich Congress, Ernest Jones read a paper approved by Freud and critical of Jung, and called for any who disapproved to abstain from voting. Jung resigned from the society. Freud was a patriot at the start of the war, and his sons served in the army. But by 1914, 1 million Austro-Hungarian soldiers had been killed or wounded, and the quick victory Freud had anticipated evaporated. Freud was prodigious during the war years, elaborating on his theory of transference in the analyst's room to assert that analysis could only succeed through transference and its interpretation. Freud argued that the analyst must be neutral and anonymous, as in remaining unknown to the patient. Although Freud had rarely followed these dictums himself, they became the ideal for psychotherapy for decades. The last patient monograph Freud wrote was published during the war years about a man called Sergei Pankejeff, known as Wolfman, who suffered from apathy, and which served as a rebuke to both Jung and Adler, who held competing views on the causes of neurosis. Freud interpreted a childhood nightmare about wolves in trees as being linked to Pankejeff witnessing his parents having sex, or the primal scene, when he was 18 months old. This and other aspects of the analysis defy comprehension today, especially since Pankejeff later told a journalist he slept in a nursery with his nanny as a child and could not have witnessed such a scene. Moreover, Pankejeff continued to suffer from what was most likely bipolar disorder. At the time, the monograph was revered, but it was Freud's last as he turned his attention back to his preferred work on the structure and operations of the mind. One of Freud's most influential essays was published during the war years, Mourning and Melancholia, which posits that depression is like grief, engendering apathy and an inability to love. Freud highlights the similarities between the state of mourning and that of depression, while crucially pinpointing the differences. Depression does not end easily and causes a reduction in self-esteem, and further, it adversely affects people close to the depressive, who are subjected to accusations disguised as self-recrimination from the depressed partner. The relationship a depressive has with a loved one is characterized by a narcissistic ambivalence that moves between love and hatred and precludes a letting go. Freud's observations about mixed feelings directed towards a partner, chosen because of the appeal of mirroring, resonate, but his narrow focus on poor object choice omits the complexity of the causes of depression as now understood. Nevertheless, Freud's mourning and melancholia influenced a generation of psychotherapists, using the term ego and referencing the interplay between the conscious and unconscious mind. The war years took their toll on Freud and his family. Food and fuel shortages made life in Vienna hard. Freud's son, Martin, was taken prisoner, Spanish flu raged, and Martha was in a sanatorium. For Freud, quote, an excess of brutality, cruelty, and mendacity was everywhere to see in the so-called civilized world, and the Treaty of Versailles a betrayal. Freud visited a spa with Martha's sister, Minna, who he openly told Martha shared his, quote, wild, passionate nature, which has given rise to speculation of an affair, but, it seems, Freud was a faithful husband, although perhaps latterly sexually inactive. One post-war consequence that affected Freud was the proliferation of cases of shell shock or post-traumatic stress disorder. Freud's theories had rested on issues of wish fulfillment, repressed sexual desire, and the pleasure principle drive, or unconscious conflict. Yet here was a condition that resulted directly from traumatic events. The idea that repetition of memories or dreams was not a result of repression of desire nullified the justification for Freud's method of analysis. Freud concluded that the drive was not necessarily the pursuit of pleasure, but a desire for death, or thanatos, since, quote, the aim of all life is death. In 1920, Freud's beloved daughter, Sophie, had died in pregnancy, and he was preoccupied by thoughts of his own death, which may have influenced his theorizing as he moved on to say that the death drive was, quote, an instinct of destruction directed against the external world and other organisms. This theory, which created obstacles for the idea of a successful analysis, was no doubt influenced by the violence witnessed during the war. Freud recognized that separating the mind into the ego, through which the analysand can address issues with the analyst, and animal instinct, which he was to call the id, was insufficient. Freud now added a third element, the superego, to his metaphysical vision to explain the conscious and unconscious properties of the ego as it grapples with drives and hidden desires. Freud here drew on recognizable aspects of the psyche, appetite, spirit, and reason, dating back to Socrates as he developed the theory in The Ego and the Id. These theories suggested multiple possible approaches in an analytical setting rather than the narrow focus of Freud's earlier work, yet were perhaps less distinctive. Freud's youngest daughter, Anna, who became a member of the Vienna Society in 1922, would later develop a theory on a particular aspect of the ego, the defenses, such as repression, sublimation, and projection, in her psychoanalytic work. Freud continued this line of thought, focusing on trying to explain the group behavior and propensity for violence that had been witnessed in World War I. In 1921, he published Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego. Echoing ideas of evolutionary biology, Freud elaborated on his theory of man's psyche being governed by a prehistoric patricide, presenting as guilt and ambivalent love towards a lost father, which predisposes him to over-identify with a leader who then becomes the ego ideal. Through identification, projection, and introjection, we enter into mass behavior. This work seems prescient in light of the political movements of the next decades. Although Freud claimed not to be political, after the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, with nationalism to the fore, Freud's awareness of anti-Semitism ever present in Austria, with the Anti-Semitic League having been established in 1896 to protect Aryan workers, was never so acute. In the late 1920s, Freud published Civilization and Its Discontents, which explored the benefits and limitations of civilization, concluding that we are forced into compromises because either civilization causes repression or something repressive in man's nature inspires civilization. In Freud's view, women resent the intrusion of society on the family and become hostile to it, partly because they aren't equipped to transform their instincts into cultural achievements. Quote, "The work of civilization has become increasingly the business of men. Men display aggression because they, quote, do not feel comfortable without it. And this leads to, quote, the narcissism of small differences." A distinctive feature of Freud's work here is the idea that the seeds of our discontents lie within us as the punitive superego pushes us to reject our instincts with the reward of civilization. This somewhat pessimistic view was perhaps a legacy of World War I and the political trouble brewing again in Europe. In 1923, Freud was diagnosed with mouth cancer after a lifetime of 20 cigars a day and endured a brutal operation followed by radiotherapy, although the tumour was most likely incurable, at the same time as dealing with other family tragedies and the devastating blow of the death from tuberculosis of his grandson, Heinz, at 4 years old. There were a further 32 surgeries, and while Freud eventually recovered his health and vitality, his speech and hearing were impaired, and he suffered from pain. Although Freud was weary of patient analysis, financial considerations meant he had to continue, and it was his later patients who gave many insights into the practice of this now famous psychotherapist. He socialized with some patients, and one gave him a chow, which was then always present in sessions. Some patients noted that they felt improvement, others left dissatisfied as he dealt with patients in different ways, but always with a view to reinforcing his theories. One skeptical patient, the psychiatrist Josef Breuer, felt Freud was out of touch with the new generation who spoke more freely about sex, and that his attitude to homosexuality, which Freud saw as, quote, something pathological that should be repressed, although not deviant, was unenlightened. Freud, whose skepticism about biographers led him to destroy notes, wrote an autobiographical study in 1925, which has offered biographers insights. In 1930, Freud was awarded the Frankfurt Goethe Prize and had undoubtedly achieved the world renown he had always hoped for. In a late work, Analysis Terminable and Interminable, published in 1937, he dismissed Otto Rank's method of shorter treatments and criticized his former friend Ferenczi's methods. Freud articulated a belief that successful analysis was at the mercy of patients' powerful defenses, notably penis envy in women and castration anxiety in men, which caused them to resist the observations of the analyst. Freud concluded that his methods had limitations and advocated conformity, even some sexual repression, for a patient to be able to live a good life. Freud always viewed religion as superstition while appreciating his Jewish heritage, but became preoccupied with religion in his late years, publishing The Future of an Illusion in 1927, which outlined his belief that religion, like dreams, represents wishes that allay fears. As extreme ideologies gained ascendancy in Germany, Italy, and Russia, Freud felt the precariousness of his position as dependent on the protection of a Catholic country. In Moses and Monotheism, he again challenged conventional religion, arguing that religious faith was neurotic and that the Oedipal complex derives from, quote, memory traces of earlier generations or archaic heritage, which are intractable. He dissected the Moses story, positing that Moses was an Egyptian who introduced monotheism, founded on repressed memory, to the Jews. He denounced European anti-Semitism, which he argued was a denial of monotheism's history, which was based on responses to the Oedipal complex. On the 12th of March 1938, Wehrmacht troops entered Vienna, welcomed by the Catholic Church. Freud's books had been burned in Berlin in 1933, and on the 13th of March 1938, brown shirts raided Freud's home, detaining his son, Martin, for hours. Freud had anticipated that Jews would suffer since Hitler's rise to power, but, like others, was convinced sanity would prevail and, quote, honest men would be left in peace in Austria. On the 22nd of March, Anna was detained by the Gestapo. After much resistance, Freud finally agreed to emigrate with his in-laws and his physician's family, Amalia having died in 1930. Like his ancestors, Freud was leaving his home, chased out by anti-Semitic fascists. His 4 sisters, who remained, were all murdered by the Nazis. Freud was warmly welcomed in England, which he had loved since a childhood visit to his step-brothers. The Royal Society made him a corresponding member, an honour he greatly treasured. He continued work on Moses and monotheism, despite being in excruciating pain from his cancer, worked 4 hours a day until his death, and received many eminent visitors to his home in Hampstead, London, such as Salvador Dali, H.G. Wells, and Chaim Weizmann, the famous Zionist leader. Minna was dying, and Freud was often depressed but still working as a psychotherapist. In September 1939, in terrible pain, Freud asked his doctor, Max Schur, to honor their prior agreement and, with Anna's consent, Schur gave Freud a dose of morphine. Freud declared, quote, with ever less regret do I wait for the curtain to fall for me, and on the 23rd of September, he passed away. The Hampstead House remains the Freud Museum today. Sigmund Freud was a remarkable man who founded the practice of psychoanalysis and had a profound influence on the field of psychiatry in the 20th century. A brilliant mind with a broad knowledge, a talented writer, and a witty and cultured man, he engendered loyalty in his colleagues and supporters, despite some misgivings among his contemporaries about his overly expansive claims and distortions about patient improvement. As a champion of the talking cure and creator of psychotherapy terms still used today, Freud popularized psychology. He wrote 23 volumes of theoretical and clinical work. Although many of the particulars of his theories are now discredited, he legitimated defiance of convention in a modern world and argued that the mind must be treated complexly with attention to inner conflict, attachments and relationships, developmental history, desire, drives and values. His view of the role of childhood and family dynamics in shaping our identities and mental health was groundbreaking. What do you think of Sigmund Freud? Did he revolutionize the field of psychology in a positive way, or were his modes of practice and assertions questionable or inevitable casualties as he challenged convention? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.